The words hit me like a physical blow, each syllable carving itself into my chest with surgical precision. You could never satisfy me, Sarah. I need someone who actually knows what they're doing. I stood there in our bedroom doorway, frozen, watching my boyfriend of 3 years casually slip his phone back into his pocket like he hadn't just delivered the most devastating critique of my entire existence. The worst part? He wasn't even looking at me when he said it. He was adjusting his tie in the mirror, getting ready for another one of his business dinners, completely oblivious to the fact that he'd just shattered something fundamental inside me. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I was certain he could hear it across the room. The familiar scent of his cologne, the same one I'd bought him for our anniversary last year, now felt suffocating, mixing with the metallic taste of humiliation that had suddenly flooded my mouth. "What did you just say?" The words scraped out of my throat barely above a whisper. Marcus finally turned around, and for a split second, I saw something flicker across his face. Guilt? Regret? But it vanished so quickly I might have imagined it, replaced by that practiced look of mild irritation he'd perfected over the past few months. "Don't be dramatic, Sarah. I was just being honest." He straightened his cufflinks with mechanical precision. "Honesty is supposed to be the foundation of a healthy relationship, right? That's what all those articles you're always reading say." The casual cruelty in his voice made my stomach lurch. This was the same man who used to trace patterns on my bare back while whispering how perfect I was. The same man who'd once told me I was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Now he stood there, looking at me like I was some disappointing purchase he was considering returning. "I heard you on the phone just now," I continued, my voice gaining strength even as my hands started trembling. "You were talking to someone about me. About us." Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You were eavesdropping?" "I live here too, Marcus." "I wasn't eavesdropping. I was coming to tell you dinner was ready, and I heard you laughing about how I'm vanilla and boring in bed, and how you need someone with actual experience." The words tasted like poison coming out of my mouth, but I forced myself to say them anyway. "Who were you talking to?" He had the audacity to look annoyed, like I was the one being unreasonable. "Does it matter?" "Look, Sarah, we're both adults here. We've been together for 3 years and the spark just isn't there anymore. At least not for me." The room started spinning slightly, and I gripped the doorframe to steady myself. 3 years. 3 years of shared mornings and lazy Sundays and inside jokes and planning a future together. 3 years of me thinking I was building something real, something lasting, while he was apparently cataloging all the ways I disappointed him. "The spark isn't there anymore," I repeated slowly, letting the words settle between us like broken glass. "So you've been discussing our sex life with who exactly?" Marcus ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, and I noticed his watch, the expensive one I'd saved up for months to buy him for his promotion. Everything in this room, everything about our life together, suddenly felt tainted. "It's not important who I was talking to," he said finally. "What's important is that we're honest about where we stand. I care about you, Sarah, I do. But I have needs and you're not experienced enough to meet them. Not experienced enough." The phrase echoed in my head like a taunt. I thought about all the times I'd initiated intimacy, only to be gently redirected or told he was too tired. All the times I'd suggested trying something new, only to be met with polite disinterest. All the times I'd wondered if there was something wrong with me, something lacking. "So what are you saying?" My voice was barely audible now, but it carried clearly in the sudden silence of our bedroom. Marcus adjusted his tie one final time and reached for his jacket. "I'm saying maybe we should take a break. Give each other some space to figure out what we really want. A break." After 3 years, after all the plans we'd made, after all the ways I'd rearranged my life to fit around his career and his schedule and his preferences, he wanted a break because I wasn't experienced enough. "Is there someone else?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, even though part of me already knew the answer from the guilty flush that crept up his neck. "Sarah, don't—" "Is there someone else, Marcus?" He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence I heard everything I needed to know. My legs felt weak, and I had to lean against the wall to keep from collapsing. "It's not what you think," he said finally, not meeting my eyes. "Nothing's happened. Not really. But there's someone I've been talking to. Someone who understands me better. Nothing's happened. Not really." The qualifier hung in the air like smoke, acrid and unmistakable. Something had happened. Maybe not everything, but something. Enough to make him look at me like I was a consolation prize he was tired of pretending to want. "Who?" I whispered. "It doesn't matter. Who, Marcus? He grabbed his keys from the dresser, the metal jangling loud in the tense quiet. I'm going to be late for dinner. We can talk about this when I get back. And just like that, he was gone, leaving me standing alone in our bedroom with the echo of his footsteps fading down the hallway. The front door clicked shut with a finality that seemed to reverberate through my entire body. I stood there for I don't know how long, staring at the space where he'd been, trying to process what had just happened. The man I'd loved for 3 years had just told me I wasn't good enough in the most fundamental way possible, and then he'd walked out to have dinner with whoever he'd been discussing my inadequacies with. The silence in the apartment was deafening. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the tick of the clock on the nightstand, the faint sound of traffic from the street below, normal sounds from a normal evening that had just become anything but normal. I sank down onto the bed, our bed, and buried my face in my hands. The tears came then, hot and angry and humiliating. I cried for the 3 years I'd apparently wasted. I cried for the future I'd thought we were building. I cried for the naive woman I'd been just 10 minutes ago, who'd actually believed she was loved. But mostly, I cried because somewhere deep down, I'd known this was coming. The distance between us had been growing for months. The way he'd stopped really looking at me. The way conversations had become perfunctory. The way he'd started working late more often, started taking phone calls in other rooms, started treating me like a roommate he was mildly fond of rather than a partner. I'd known, and I'd chosen to ignore it because facing it would have meant admitting that I wasn't enough, that I'd never been enough. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and for a pathetic moment, I hoped it might be Marcus calling to apologize, to take it all back. But it was just a notification from some app, meaningless and automated. I picked up the phone anyway, my hands still shaking, and found myself scrolling through our text history. Messages from just yesterday, me asking if he wanted me to pick up anything from the store, him responding with a simple, no thanks. Messages from last week, me sending him a funny meme, him responding with a single emoji. Messages from last month, me telling him I missed him while he was on his business trip, him saying, miss you too. Hours later, like an afterthought. When had we become strangers living in the same space? When had I become someone he discussed with other people as a disappointment? I scrolled further back to the beginning of our relationship, and the contrast was devastating. Long conversations that stretched late into the night, photos we'd taken together, both of us smiling and happy and completely absorbed in each other. Plans we'd made for the future, dreams we'd shared. That woman in those early messages, she'd been confident, playful, secure in being loved. What had happened to her? The answer came to me with painful clarity. She'd been slowly eroded by 3 years of subtle criticism and gentle redirection and the gradual withdrawal of enthusiasm. She'd been replaced by someone who second-guessed herself constantly, who'd started to see her own desires as inconvenient, who'd learned to be grateful for scraps of attention. I set the phone aside and looked around our bedroom with new eyes. Everything here told the story of a relationship where one person's preferences had gradually taken precedence over everything else. The art on the walls was all his choice. The furniture was all his style. Even the books on the nightstand were his recommendations. Where was I in this space? Where had I gone? The sound of laughter from the apartment above us drifted down through the ceiling, and I found myself wondering what it would feel like to laugh like that again. Carefree and genuine and completely unself-conscious. I couldn't remember the last time Marcus had made me laugh. Really laugh, not just the polite chuckle I'd perfected when he told one of his work stories for the 100th time. My phone buzzed again, another notification, and this time I actually looked at it. A message from my friend Jessica. Hope you're having a good evening. Haven't heard from you in ages. We should catch up soon. Haven't heard from you in ages. When was the last time I'd talked to Jessica? Or any of my friends, really? I'd been so focused on being the perfect girlfriend, on not being too demanding or too needy, that I'd gradually let most of my other relationships fade into the background. Another wave of anger washed over me, but this time it was directed at myself as much as at Marcus. How had I let myself become so small? How had I allowed someone else's opinion of me to become the only one that mattered? I thought about the woman he'd been talking to, the one who understood him better. I wondered if she knew she was about to inherit a man who discussed his girlfriend's sexual inadequacies with other people. I wondered if she thought she was different, special, the exception to his apparent pattern of finding fault with the women in his life. The thought sparked something dark and bitter in my chest. Let her find out the hard way what kind of man she was dealing with. Let her discover that his honesty was really just cruelty dressed up in reasonable-sounding words. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't enough. The humiliation I felt wasn't going away just because karma might eventually catch up with Marcus. The damage he'd done to my self-worth wasn't going to heal just because he might someday do the same thing to someone else. I stood up and walked to the mirror, the same one he'd been using to adjust his tie while he casually destroyed my confidence. The woman looking back at me was red-eyed and blotchy, but there was something else there too. Something I hadn't seen in a long time. Anger. Real, clean, righteous anger. Not the twisted, internalized anger that had been eating away at me for months, making me question everything about myself. This was different. This was the anger of someone who'd finally seen clearly, who'd finally understood that the problem wasn't her inadequacy, but his arrogance. Marcus thought I was boring, inexperienced, not good enough to satisfy him. Marcus was wrong. The thought hit me with surprising force, and I found myself standing up straighter, my reflection changing as my posture shifted. I wasn't boring. I wasn't inadequate. I'd been careful, considerate, responsive to what I thought he wanted. I'd been a good partner. He'd been a selfish one. The realization was like stepping out of a dark room into sunlight. Suddenly, I could see everything differently. The way he'd gradually trained me to prioritize his pleasure over my own. The way he'd made me feel grateful for basic attention. The way he'd convinced me that my desires were somehow less valid than his. I thought about all the times I'd wanted to try something new, to be more adventurous, but had held back because I was afraid of seeming too eager or too demanding. All the times I'd swallowed my own wants because I was so focused on being the perfect, undemanding girlfriend. What if I'd been wrong to hold back? What if the problem wasn't that I was too inexperienced, but that I'd been wasting my experience on someone who didn't deserve it? My phone buzzed again, and this time I picked it up immediately. Jessica's contact photo smiled back at me, and for the first time in hours, I felt something other than pain. I scrolled through my contacts, looking at all the friends I'd gradually lost touch with while I'd been so focused on my relationship with Marcus. All the invitations I'd declined because he'd had other plans. All the conversations I'd cut short because he'd needed something. When had I become so isolated? When had my world shrunk down to just him and his needs and his opinions? The answer was obvious. Gradually, over 3 years, one small compromise at a time. But that didn't mean it had to stay that way. I found myself thinking about David, Marcus's best friend. They'd been close since college, and I'd always liked David's easy humor and genuine warmth. He was the opposite of Marcus in many ways. Where Marcus was calculated and image-conscious, David was spontaneous and authentic. Where Marcus measured his words carefully, David spoke from the heart. And where Marcus was increasingly critical and distant, David had always been kind to me. Genuinely kind, not just polite. I remembered a conversation we'd had at Marcus's birthday party last month. David had complimented a dress I was wearing, but not in the perfunctory way Marcus had learned to do. He'd actually looked at me when he said it, had seemed to really see me in a way that Marcus hadn't in months. "That color is incredible on you," he'd said, and there had been something in his voice that made me feel beautiful in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. At the time, I'd brushed off the compliment, too loyal to Marcus to really absorb it. But now, thinking back, I remembered the way David's eyes had lingered on me that night, the way he'd found reasons to talk to me throughout the party, the way he'd seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. Had I been blind to something that was right in front of me? The thought was dangerous, thrilling in a way that made my pulse quicken. David was attractive. I'd always known that, even when I was completely committed to Marcus. Tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair and eyes that crinkled when he smiled. The kind of man who looked good in everything from a suit to jeans and a t-shirt. More importantly, he was the kind of man who made me feel interesting when I talked to him. Who asked follow-up questions and seemed to genuinely care about the answers. Who laughed at my jokes and made me feel clever and funny and worth paying attention to. Everything Marcus had stopped doing months ago. I shook my head, trying to clear away the dangerous direction my thoughts were taking. David was Marcus's best friend. Even if I was done with Marcus, and the thought was becoming more real by the minute, going after David would be complicated, messy, potentially devastating to their friendship. But then I remembered Marcus's words. "You could never satisfy me, Sarah." The casual cruelty of it hit me again, fresh and sharp. He'd humiliated me, dismissed 3 years of my love and effort like they meant nothing. He'd discussed my most intimate moments with someone else, turned me into a joke, a disappointment to be analyzed and found wanting. Why should I protect his friendship when he hadn't bothered to protect my dignity? The thought was intoxicating in its simplicity. Marcus had made it clear that he didn't value what we had together. He'd already checked out of our relationship emotionally, was probably already planning his exit strategy with whoever he'd been talking to on the phone. What if I beat him to it? What if I showed him exactly how inexperienced and boring I really wasn't? I walked back to the mirror and studied my reflection again. This time, I didn't see a woman who'd been rejected and found wanting. I saw someone who'd been undervalued and taken for granted by a man who didn't deserve her. My hair was still tousled from running my hands through it, but it looked tousled in a good way, like I'd just gotten out of bed after doing something much more interesting than crying. My lips were fuller from the tears, my cheeks flushed with emotion in a way that actually made me look more alive than I had in months. I looked like a woman with fire in her veins instead of the careful, controlled person I'd become over the past year. When was the last time I'd felt fire in my veins? When was the last time I'd done something spontaneous, something that surprised even me? I couldn't remember, and that realization was almost as painful as Marcus's rejection had been. But it didn't have to stay that way. My phone was still in my hand, David's contact information just a few taps away. I found myself staring at his name, my heart rate increasing with each second that passed. What would happen if I called him? What would I even say? Before I could lose my nerve, I was scrolling through his social media instead. David posted regularly, unlike Marcus, who treated social media like a necessary evil for his professional image. David's feed was full of life. Photos from hiking trips, meals with friends, funny observations about daily life. His most recent post was from earlier today, a photo of a cocktail at some upscale bar downtown, with the caption, "Sometimes you need to drink something that costs more than your dinner just to remind yourself you're an adult." The post had been made about an hour ago. He was out somewhere, probably alone based on the single drink in the photo. Available. I found myself wondering what he was doing right now. Whether he was still at that bar. Whether he was thinking about going home to an empty apartment, the same way I was thinking about spending the evening alone in a space that no longer felt like home. The idea that formed in my mind was so bold, so completely unlike anything I'd ever considered before, that it made my hands shake. But it also made me feel more alive than I had in months. Marcus thought I was boring, inexperienced, unable to satisfy him. What if I proved him wrong in the most spectacular way possible? What if I showed him exactly what he was giving up, in a way that would make it impossible for him to ever underestimate me again? The plan that began to take shape was risky, potentially devastating, and absolutely nothing like the careful, considerate person I'd trained myself to be over the past 3 years. It was perfect. I looked at myself in the mirror one more time, and this time the woman looking back at me was a stranger. Someone with steel in her spine and mischief in her eyes. Someone who was done being underestimated. Someone who was about to remind everyone involved exactly what they'd been taking for granted. I picked up my phone and started typing a message to David before I could change my mind. "Hey, I saw your post. Mind if I join you for that overpriced cocktail? I could use some adult company tonight." My finger hovered over the send button for a moment that felt like an eternity. Once I sent this message, there would be no going back. I'd be crossing a line that would change everything. The woman I'd been an hour ago would never have considered it. She would have waited for Marcus to come home, would have tried to have a mature conversation about their relationship, would have fought to save something that was already dead. But that woman was gone, destroyed by the casual cruelty of a man who'd taken her love for granted for too long. I pressed send. The message showed as delivered immediately, and I felt a rush of adrenaline that was better than any drug. Whatever happened next, I was no longer passive. I was no longer waiting for someone else to determine my worth. I was taking control. My phone buzzed with a response faster than I'd expected. "Sarah? Of course. I'm at the Meridian on 5th Street. Everything okay?" The concern in his message made my chest tight with something I hadn't felt in a long time. The knowledge that someone cared about my well-being without calculating what it would cost them. I typed back quickly, "Define okay, but I'll explain when I get there. Order me something strong." His response came back immediately, "On it. See you soon." I set the phone aside and looked around the bedroom one more time. In a few minutes, I'd be getting dressed to go meet my boyfriend's best friend for drinks. In a few hours, depending on how the evening went, I might be doing something that would change all of our lives forever. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, it made me feel powerful in a way I'd forgotten was possible. I walked to the closet and started looking through my clothes with new eyes. Not the careful, appropriate wardrobe I'd curated to match Marcus's image of the perfect girlfriend. I was looking for something that would remind me who I'd been before I'd started shrinking myself to fit into someone else's life. In the back of the closet, I found it. A dress I'd bought impulsively about a year ago but had never worn. It was deep red, fitted in all the right places, and shorter than anything I'd worn in Marcus's presence. I'd loved it in the store, had felt beautiful and confident trying it on, but somehow I'd never found the right occasion to wear it. Or maybe I'd just been too afraid of drawing the wrong kind of attention. Tonight, the wrong kind of attention was exactly what I was looking for. I pulled the dress off the hanger and held it up to myself in the mirror. The color made my skin glow and my dark hair look richer. It was sophisticated but also undeniably sexy, the kind of dress that made a statement without saying a word. It was perfect. As I started to change clothes, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd overheard earlier. Marcus discussing my inadequacies with someone, laughing about how boring I was in bed, how I couldn't satisfy him. I wondered who he'd been talking to. A coworker? Another friend? The mysterious someone who understood him better? It didn't matter. What mattered was that after tonight, Marcus would never again be able to claim that I was boring or inexperienced or unable to satisfy anyone. Because I was about to prove him wrong in the most unforgettable way possible, I slipped into the red dress and looked at myself in the mirror. The transformation was remarkable, not just in how I looked, but in how I felt. This was the woman I'd been before I'd learned to make myself smaller. This was who I could be again. I applied makeup with a heavier hand than usual, emphasizing my eyes and lips in a way that Marcus had always subtly discouraged as too much. Tonight, too much was exactly what I was going for. My hair went up in a style that was elegant but slightly messy, like I might have more interesting things to do later than worry about keeping every strand in place. When I was finished, I looked like someone who had secrets, someone who was capable of surprises, someone who was definitely not boring. I grabbed my purse and headed for the door, my heels clicking confidently on the hardwood floor. As I reached for the doorknob, I paused for just a moment, looking back at the apartment that had been my home for the past year and a half. By the time I came back tonight, everything would be different. Maybe I'd be single. Maybe I'd have crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Maybe I'd have started something that would complicate my life in ways I couldn't even imagine yet. But I'd also have my self-respect back. I'd have proof that I was more than Marcus's limited imagination could comprehend, and sometimes that was worth any amount of complications. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, my heart pounding with anticipation and determination in equal measure. Marcus thought he knew who I was. He thought he had me figured out, categorized, dismissed. He was about to learn how wrong he'd been about everything. The Meridian was exactly the kind of place Marcus would never take me to. Dark, intimate, with exposed brick walls and the kind of lighting that made everyone look like they had secrets worth keeping. I spotted David immediately at the bar, his broad shoulders unmistakable even from behind. He'd changed from whatever he'd been wearing earlier into dark jeans and a black button-down that fit him perfectly, sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. Even just sitting there, he had a presence that Marcus had never possessed, relaxed but alert, confident without trying too hard. He turned when he heard my heels on the hardwood floor, and the look that crossed his face when he saw me was everything I'd hoped for and more. His eyes widened slightly, then traveled slowly from my face down to my dress and back up again, not in a way that felt predatory, but in a way that felt appreciative, hungry even. When his gaze met mine again, there was something different there, something I'd never seen when he looked at me as Marcus's girlfriend, Sarah. My name came out slightly breathless, and he stood as I approached, his height even more impressive up close. "You look..." He paused, seeming to search for the right word. "Incredible." The compliment hit me like a physical thing, warm and genuine in a way that Marcus's perfunctory comments hadn't been in months. I felt my cheeks flush, but this time it wasn't from humiliation. It was from the heady rush of being truly seen by someone who clearly liked what he was looking at. "Thank you." I slid onto the bar stool next to his, acutely aware of how the dress rode up slightly as I crossed my legs. David's eyes followed the movement briefly before he caught himself, and I felt a thrill of power that was completely intoxicating. When was the last time I'd made a man lose his train of thought just by sitting down? "I ordered you something?" he said, gesturing to a cocktail that was already waiting, something dark and sophisticated looking with a cherry garnish. I figured after that cryptic text, you might need something with some bite to it. I took a sip and felt the whiskey burn pleasantly down my throat. It was strong, complex, nothing like the sweet drinks Marcus always ordered for me because he thought they were more feminine. This tasted like rebellion and possibility. Perfect, I said and meant it. How did you know I needed exactly this? David smiled, and I noticed for the first time how his whole face changed when he did. Not just his mouth, but his eyes, the way he held his shoulders. Everything. It was like watching someone light up from the inside. Lucky guess. He paused, studying my face with an intensity that made my skin warm. Want to tell me what's going on? You seemed upset in your message. The question hung between us, and I realized this was the moment where I had to decide how far I was really willing to go. I could tell him something vague, keep things surface level, maybe just enjoy a few drinks with someone who actually seemed happy to see me. Or I could tell him the truth and see where that led us. I took another sip of the cocktail, feeling the alcohol bloom warm in my chest, and made my choice. Marcus and I had a fight tonight. The words came out steadier than I felt. A big one. David's expression shifted immediately, concern replacing the easy flirtation. Are you okay? What happened? There was something so genuine about the way he asked that I almost started crying again. When was the last time someone had asked if I was okay and actually waited for the real answer? He told me I could never satisfy him. The words tasted bitter even with the whiskey coating my tongue. Said I'm not experienced enough for his needs. I watched David's face carefully as I spoke, looking for any sign of the male solidarity I half expected, the automatic defensiveness men sometimes showed when other men were criticized. Instead, I saw his jaw tighten and something dark flash in his eyes. He said what? His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it that made my pulse quicken. You heard me. I set my glass down with more force than necessary, the clink of crystal against wood sharp in the ambient noise of the bar. Apparently I'm boring in bed. Vanilla. Not capable of meeting his sophisticated needs. I laughed, but it came out harsh and bitter. He was discussing it with someone on the phone when I got home, having a good laugh about my inadequacies. David was quiet for a long moment, his hands clenched around his own glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Marcus is an idiot. Is he? I turned to face him more fully, noting how his eyes immediately dropped to the neckline of my dress before snapping back to my face. Or is he right? Maybe I really am just boring. Maybe I really don't know what I'm doing. I let vulnerability creep into my voice, even though underneath it I was calculating, watching his reaction, testing his boundaries. Sarah. The way he said my name made something flutter low in my stomach. Look at me. I did, getting caught in those dark eyes that were suddenly intense with something I couldn't quite name. You are not boring. Each word was deliberate, weighted. Any man who thinks that is too stupid to deserve you. The compliment sent heat rushing through my body, but it was his next words that really got my attention. Marcus doesn't know what he has. David's voice dropped lower, more intimate. He never has. The admission hung in the air like a confession, and I felt something shift between us, a door opening that had been locked for the 3 years I'd been with his best friend. What do you mean? David looked down at his drink, seeming to wrestle with something internal. I probably shouldn't say this. Tonight seems like a good night for saying things we probably shouldn't. I leaned closer, close enough to catch the scent of his cologne, something warmer and more complex than Marcus's. What do you mean he doesn't know what he has? He met my eyes again, and this time I saw the honesty there, raw and unguarded. I mean, I've watched him take you for granted for months. I've watched him treat you like you're lucky to be with him when it's the other way around. His voice got rougher, more passionate. I've watched him ignore you at parties, dismiss things you say, act like your opinions don't matter. And I've wanted to shake him and ask him if he's lost his damn mind. The words hit me like a physical thing, validation I didn't even know I'd been craving. You noticed. Of course I noticed. His laugh was short and bitter. I notice everything about you, Sarah. The way you light up when you talk about books. The way you actually listen when people are speaking instead of just waiting for your turn to talk. The way you remember details about everyone's lives and ask follow-up questions. The way you look in that red dress that's driving me absolutely crazy right now. The last admission came out in a rush, and I saw him tense like he hadn't meant to say it. But it was too late. The words were out there between us, electric and dangerous and exactly what I'd been hoping to hear. David. I let his name linger on my tongue, watched the way his pupils dilated when I said it. "How long have you been noticing these things about me?" He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. Then, "Since the first time Marcus brought you around. 3 years ago." Another pause. "I told myself it was just because you were new that it would fade. It never did." 3 years. He'd been watching me, wanting me, for 3 years while I was completely oblivious, focused entirely on trying to be perfect for a man who was apparently discussing my sexual inadequacies with other people. The irony was almost funny, if it wasn't so devastating. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "Because you were happy." His voice was soft now, almost sad. "Or I thought you were. And because Marcus is my best friend, and you don't do that to someone you care about." He looked at me directly. "But if he's stupid enough to let you go?" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The implication hung between us like a promise, dangerous and intoxicating. I finished my drink in one long swallow, feeling the liquid courage burn through my system. "He didn't let me go." "Not exactly. He wants a break. Time to figure out what we both really want." "And what do you want?" The question was quiet, loaded with possibility. I looked at David, really looked at him. The strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell slightly over his forehead, the broad shoulders that filled out his shirt perfectly, the kindness in his eyes that I'd been too loyal to really see before. The intelligence and humor and genuine warmth that Marcus had never possessed. What did I want? I wanted to feel desired instead of tolerated. I wanted to feel beautiful instead of adequate. I wanted to be with someone who saw me as a prize instead of a consolation. I wanted to remind myself who I was before I'd started shrinking to fit into someone else's limited vision of me. Most importantly, I wanted Marcus to understand exactly what he was giving up. I wanted him to realize that the woman he'd dismissed as boring and inexperienced was capable of inspiring passion in someone else, someone he respected, someone whose opinion mattered to him. "I want to not be boring," I said finally, letting my voice drop to match his intimate tone. "I want to be with someone who appreciates what I have to offer instead of cataloging what I lack." David's breathing changed slightly, and I saw his grip tighten on his empty glass. "Sarah, I want to prove to myself that I'm not the problem in this equation." I leaned closer, close enough that our knees were almost touching. "And I think I want to prove it with you." The words were out before I could second-guess them, bold and honest and completely unlike anything I would have said even 6 hours ago. But they felt right. They felt like the truth I'd been too afraid to admit even to myself. David went very still, his eyes searching my face like he was trying to determine if I meant what I thought I meant. "You're upset," he said carefully. "You're hurt and angry, and you're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months." I reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the bar, felt the way his fingers twitched under mine. "I'm thinking clearly enough to realize that I've been wasting 3 years on someone who doesn't deserve me. I'm thinking clearly enough to see that there's someone right in front of me who's been seeing me, really seeing me, all along." His hand turned palm up under mine, his fingers threading through mine with a naturalness that took my breath away. "This is complicated." "I know. If we do this, everything changes. My friendship with Marcus, your relationship with him, everything. It's already changed." I squeezed his fingers. He changed it when he decided I wasn't worth fighting for. When he decided I was something to be discussed and dismissed rather than loved and protected. My voice got stronger, more certain. "I'm not going to spend one more day feeling like I'm not enough when there's someone sitting right here looking at me like I'm everything." David's thumb traced across my knuckles, sending shivers up my arm. "You are everything." The admission was quiet, reverent. "You've always been everything." The bartender appeared then, asking if we wanted another round, and the interruption broke some of the intensity of the moment. But it also gave me time to think, to plan, to consider exactly how I wanted the rest of this evening to unfold. "Actually," I said, never taking my eyes off David's face, "I think I'd prefer somewhere more private." "Your place?" His sharp intake of breath was audible even over the bar noise. "Are you sure?" Instead of answering with words, I stood up and gathered my purse, noting with satisfaction the way his eyes followed the movement of my body. "Pay the check," I said, letting my voice drop to something that was almost a purr. "I'll wait outside." I walked away without looking back, my hips swaying slightly more than usual, knowing he was watching. The cool evening air hit my skin as I stepped onto the sidewalk, but I felt anything but cold. I felt alive. powerful, in control of my own destiny for the first time in longer than I could remember. David appeared beside me within minutes, and I could feel the tension radiating off him as he hailed a cab. During the short ride to his apartment, we sat close enough that I could feel the heat of his body, but we didn't talk. The silence was charged, full of anticipation and possibility, and the knowledge that we were crossing a line we couldn't uncross. His apartment was a revelation, warm and lived in and completely different from the sterile showcase Marcus and I shared. Books everywhere, artwork that actually meant something to him, comfortable furniture that invited you to stay a while. It was the home of someone who prioritized experiences over appearances, authenticity over image. "Can I get you something to drink?" he asked, but his voice was distracted, like he was having trouble focusing on mundane things when I was standing in his living room in that red dress. "Later," I said, setting my purse down and turning to face him fully. "Right now, I want you to kiss me." The request, no, the demand, surprised even me with its boldness. But I was done being passive, done waiting for other people to take action while I hoped for the best. If I wanted something, I was going to ask for it. David went very still, his eyes locked on mine. "Sarah, if we do this, stop talking about consequences." I stepped closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "Stop thinking about Marcus and friendship and what it all means. Just for tonight, stop thinking about everything except what you want." "What I want?" His voice was rough, strained. "I want you. I've wanted you for 3 years. I want to show you how a man should treat a woman he cares about. I want to make you forget every way he ever made you feel inadequate." His hands came up to frame my face, his thumbs tracing my cheekbones. "But I also don't want you to hate yourself tomorrow." The tenderness in his touch almost undid me, but I forced myself to stay focused. "The only thing I'll hate tomorrow is if I let fear stop me from taking what I want tonight." That seemed to be all the permission he needed. His mouth came down on mine, and it was everything Marcus's kisses hadn't been in months. Passionate, desperate, like he'd been starving for the taste of me. His hands tangled in my hair, and I could feel 3 years of suppressed desire in the way he held me against him. I kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring all my anger and hurt and need into the connection between us. This was what it was supposed to feel like something vital, something necessary. Not the perfunctory kisses Marcus and I had shared lately, more habit than desire. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard. David's hair was messed up from my fingers, and I could see my lipstick on his mouth. He looked like a man who'd been thoroughly kissed, and the sight sent a thrill of satisfaction through me. "Bedroom?" I asked, amazed at my own boldness. "Are you absolutely sure?" His voice was strained with the effort of restraint. "Because once we cross this line, we've already crossed it." I reached up and traced the edge of his jaw with my fingertip, felt the slight roughness of his 5 o'clock shadow. "The question is whether we're going to stand here overthinking it, or whether you're going to show me what I've been missing." Something shifted in his expression then, the careful control giving way to raw want. "What you've been missing?" he repeated like he was savoring the words. "Sarah, if you only knew." Instead of finishing the sentence, he swept me up in his arms, actually lifted me off the ground like I weighed nothing, and carried me toward his bedroom. The gesture was so unexpectedly romantic, so completely different from Marcus's practical approach to everything, that I felt my heart do something complicated in my chest. His bedroom was as welcoming as the rest of his apartment. Warm colors, soft lighting, a king-size bed that looked like it was meant for more than just sleeping. He set me down gently next to the bed, and for a moment we just looked at each other, the weight of what we were about to do settling between us. "Last chance to change your mind," he said softly. Instead of answering, I reached behind myself and slowly pulled down the zipper of my dress. The sound was loud in the quiet room, and I watched David's eyes darken as the fabric loosened. I let the dress slide off my shoulders and pool at my feet, leaving me in just my lingerie, black lace that I'd chosen specifically for how it made me feel, sexy, confident, powerful. David's sharp intake of breath was audible, and when I looked at his face, I saw something there that Marcus hadn't shown me in longer than I could remember. Pure, undiluted desire. "You're so beautiful," he said, his voice rough with want. "So damn beautiful." The compliment hit me like a physical touch, warming me from the inside out. I stepped closer to him, reaching for the buttons of his shirt. "Show me," I said simply. What followed was unlike anything I'd experienced with Marcus, not just because David was different, but because I was different. I wasn't the careful, considerate girlfriend trying to please her partner while suppressing her own desires. I was a woman taking what she wanted, asking for what she needed, refusing to diminish herself for anyone else's comfort. David was reverent and passionate in turns, worshiping my body like it was something precious, while also responding to my increasing boldness with an enthusiasm that made me feel powerful. Every sound I made seemed to drive him wild. Every touch I initiated was met with encouragement and reciprocation that told me I was doing everything right. This was what I'd been missing. This sense of being desired, not just tolerated, of being seen as an active participant rather than a passive recipient. This feeling of being enough, more than enough, exactly as I was. Afterward, as we lay tangled together in his sheets, I felt a satisfaction that went deeper than the physical. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Like the woman I'd been before I'd learned to make myself smaller. David's voice trailed off as he traced patterns on my bare shoulder. Better than boring? I suggested, unable to keep the satisfaction out of my voice. He laughed, the sound rumbling against my back where I was pressed against his chest. That was incredible. You're incredible. He paused and I could feel him looking down at me. Marcus is the biggest fool who ever lived. The mention of Marcus's name brought reality crashing back, but instead of guilt, I felt a surge of vindictive satisfaction. Marcus thought I was boring, inexperienced, unable to satisfy a man. Marcus was wrong and I had proof now. Delicious, overwhelming proof. But more than that, I had something else. I had an idea. David? I shifted so I could look at him, noting how his eyes immediately dropped to my bare breasts before snapping back to my face. Even now, even after everything we'd just done, he still looked at me like he couldn't quite believe I was real. What is it? I smiled, feeling wicked and powerful and completely unlike the woman who'd been crying in her bedroom just a few hours earlier. How do you feel about making a video? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications. David's eyes widened slightly as he processed what I was suggesting. A video, he repeated slowly. Nothing that shows faces, I said quickly, my mind already working through the logistics. Nothing that could identify us specifically, just proof. Evidence that Marcus was wrong about me being boring. I watched David's expression carefully as he considered this. I could see the exact moment he understood what I was really asking. Not just to make a video, but to help me get revenge on his best friend in the most intimate way possible. Sarah, his voice was careful, measured. Are you sure that's something you want to do? Once something like that exists. It won't be for public consumption, I assured him. Just for Marcus. Just so he understands exactly what he gave up when he decided I wasn't good enough for him. David was quiet for a long moment, his fingers still tracing patterns on my skin. He really hurt you, he said finally. He did. I didn't try to hide the pain in my voice. He made me feel small and inadequate and boring. He discussed our intimate life with other people like it was a joke. He made me question everything about myself. My voice got stronger, more determined. I want him to know that the problem was never me. I want him to see exactly how wrong he was. And you want me to help you do that? I want you to help me show him what he lost. I shifted so I was straddling him, noting with satisfaction how his breathing changed immediately. I want him to see that another man, his best friend, finds me anything but boring. The idea was taking clearer shape in my mind now, and the more I thought about it, the more perfect it seemed. Marcus prided himself on being sophisticated, experienced, the kind of man who could satisfy any woman. Learning that his supposedly inexperienced girlfriend had not only moved on immediately, but had done so with his best friend, and that she'd been anything but boring in the process, would destroy his ego in exactly the way he'd destroyed mine. This could ruin my friendship with Marcus, David said, but I could hear in his voice that he was considering it. Your friendship was already ruined the moment I walked into this apartment, I pointed out. The only question is whether he finds out by accident later, or whether we control how he finds out. David's hands came up to rest on my hips, and I could see the internal war playing out on his face. What exactly are you thinking? I leaned down to kiss him, slow and deliberate, feeling him respond immediately despite his reservations. I'm thinking we make something that shows him exactly what he's missing. Something that makes it very clear how much I'm enjoying myself with someone who actually appreciates me. When I pulled back, David's eyes were dark with renewed desire. You really want to do this? I really want to do this. I started moving against him, slowly, deliberately, and watched his resolve crumble in real time. Unless you have a problem with showing Marcus what a real man can do for his supposedly boring ex-girlfriend? The challenge in my voice seemed to flip a switch in David. His grip on my hips tightened, and I saw something predatory flicker in his eyes. "I don't have a problem with that at all," he said, his voice dropping to a growl that made my pulse quicken. "Good." I reached for his phone on the nightstand, noting how his eyes tracked my movement. Because I think it's time Marcus learned exactly how wrong he was about everything. What happened next was even more intense than our first time together. There was an element of performance to it, yes, but it was performance fueled by genuine passion and 3 years of suppressed attraction. David seemed determined to prove that I was anything but boring, and I was equally determined to show exactly how much I could enjoy myself with someone who actually wanted me. The video we made was tasteful but unmistakably passionate. No faces, but enough of our bodies to make it clear what was happening and how much we were both enjoying it. The sounds I made were genuine, the responses David drew from me were real, and the chemistry between us was undeniable. When it was over, we lay together again, both of us breathing hard and slightly shocked by what we'd just done. "I can't believe we just did that," David said, but he didn't sound regretful. He sounded amazed. "I can't believe how good that felt," I replied honestly. Not just the physical part, though that was incredible, but the feeling of taking control, of not being passive anymore. David turned to look at me, his expression serious. "What happens now?" I thought about Marcus, probably still at his dinner, probably still discussing my inadequacies with whoever would listen. I thought about going home to our apartment and pretending everything was normal while he decided whether I was worth keeping around. I thought about the woman I'd been just hours ago, careful, accommodating, grateful for scraps of attention. That woman was gone. In her place was someone who knew her own worth, someone who wouldn't accept being treated as less than she deserved. Someone who was about to make sure Marcus understood exactly what he'd lost. "Now," I said, reaching for David's phone again, "we send Marcus a message he'll never forget."